Quiet, please. We're just having trouble hearing Mr. Lawless here.
Just fire it up, okay. All right. And consultation's been poor, and there was no sufficient interface with Waitapu. Now, the Crown's only concession in this inquiry was that the duty of active protection may require it to take steps to protect Waitapu. Well, the claimants say to that, sir, that the duty of active protection actually does require the Crown to take proper steps to protect Waitapu, and that's been brought out in the Haureki report, the Roroa report. The Manukau Tribunal again found that Waitapu weren't adequately protected and that ownership and control were not adequately secured. And we'd submit that all of those principles and findings are equally applicable in this area, sir, in this inquiry. So the legacy that's been afforded to Te Raki Māori is one of wide-ranging destruction and desecration of some of the most holy and sacred Waitapu sites. And seemingly more comprehensive protection in recent legislation doesn't help overcome the problems that have occurred, because most of this happened in the 19th and 20th centuries. It's already been done. In our submission, sir, the Crown's failure to ensure the claimants' rangatiratanga and kaitiakitanga over their Waitapu has left them disenfranchised and spiritually disconnected. Again, sir, UNDRIP becomes relevant. Article 11, right to maintain, protect, develop the past, historical sites. At Article 12, privacy in the religious and cultural sites, use and control of ceremonial objects, and so on. Armstrong, O'Malley and Sterling basically said, well, forget about the 19th century. There was no attempt to protect Waitapu during that period, and in fact the Crown didn't recognise any treaty-based role to provide protection until the end of the 1980s. But if we look back, and there's probably a couple of bookends here, so there's the Public Works Act 1864, and when that was being introduced to Parliament, the Premier stood up and said, well, So the Premier says, well, the treaty gives us sovereign rights, and that includes the right to push a road through a graveyard. And we come later on under the RMA and a claim in Wellington to the Environmental Court, the Takamoa trustees' decision, and that's exactly what happened, where the Environment Court said, well, yes, we understand this, but it's got to take a lower level of precedence to the greater good we need this road to go through, and that's just to me, sir, that's just a fundamental misunderstanding of how deeply this goes. It's not just it shouldn't be just a consideration. It should be a primary consideration. It should be. They should be able to say, look, no, you can't put your road through there because our ancestors are buried.
Mr. Lawless, I just noticed that the time for these submissions has gone over the 30-minute mark.
Okay.
Did you want to wrap things up?
On. Can I move quickly on to health? Or will we put those in writing?
Sir, can I just explain what we're planning to do is reduce the time for the 2063 delivery by 20 minutes, Your Honour. So.
Yeah.
Well then, let's move on to health.
Move on to health, yeah. And health is a very similar thing. We're adopting the generic submissions, but we're focusing here on failure to effectively. Our submission is that the Crown knew about the problems with health and knew about the disparity, knew about Maori proposals to address that, and they didn't do it, and we've still got this big problem. We also look specifically at mental health and at the loss of traditional healing as they affected Ms. Egan and her family. So, starting point is prior to contact with Pākehā, pre-Maori, pre-European get is this infectious diseases that takes out 2/3 of the population. Now, in our submission, sir, the Crown must have known about that, and in fact it was in the 1837 Parliamentary Select Report. Now what they were really they were talking about some of the other effects, deleterious effects of settlement on native populations, but certainly there's at least 2 mentions of disease, one in Australia and one in the Sandwich Islands. What we would say, sir, is that the Crown says, well, we couldn't do anything about that, you know, we didn't have the medical knowledge. It was the 1840s, you know, there wasn't anything there. But in fact, sir, there were things that they could have done. There was quarantining, there was vaccination for smallpox, came in at a very early stage. But even when we get through to the 20th century with tuberculosis, there's a vaccine in the 20s called BCG, but the government didn't want to use it, didn't introduce it until the 40s. Well, that 20-year period is dead people. And then when we come through post the Second World War, we might have assumed that, you know, it's a new world, it's a brave new world, and things are going to get better for everybody, for Pākehā, for Maori. But when we come through to the 1980s, the mid-1980s, we find that that hasn't actually happened. And we get this report in 1984 by Dr. Pomare that says, look at these statistics up to 1975 and we see these real problems, these real disparities between the health of non-Maori and Maori. Heart disease, high blood pressure, cancer, respiratory disease, motor vehicle accidents, kidney disease, diabetes, blah, blah, blah. They're responsible for at least 3 times the death rate in Maori people under 65. And he said that any substantial improvement, quite prescient really, in Maori health status would only come about by primary preventive measures. And that same year we had the hui whakaronga. And the Director General of Health at the time there said, well, Maori people have clearly demonstrated their capability of providing a valid and legitimate Maori perspective on health. They want to be involved, desire self-determination and the ability to maintain control over their destiny. This presents a challenge to today's health system and it requires a commitment to cross-cultural understanding, change in attitudes and a change in the way things have been done in the past. Well, that was 33 years ago and if you listen to anything or read anything that the Health Department puts out now, it's saying exactly the same things. And there's been times in between. And there's a fairly consistent theme that comes through. The Maori concept of health is more holistic. It's rooted in a different worldview, te ao Māori, and it encompasses spiritual, mental, family, physical unity, harmony and well-being. They said that health services have to be accessible and they have to be delivered in a culturally sensitive way. They should include both modern and traditional knowledge, and they would have determined for themselves what their needs are and how best those needs can be met. So in 1992, the Minister of Health says, yes, we're going to do that. We're going to change the system. It's going to provide greater participation, better resource allocation. Okay. So why was the government still promising that system 8 years after the hui whakaronga, and why are they still talking about it 25 years later? I've dealt with infectious diseases. If I can move on now to mental health, because this is an area where the Ms Egan has a particular interest. Again, Maori fare worse than non-Maori in mental health, and there was a problem highlighted quite some time ago. In 1994, the government was warned that care needs to be exercised in making the diagnosis to ensure that any diagnosis of psychoses such as schizophrenia is correct, not simply a convenient label mistakenly applied because the practitioner is unaware of Maori-specific factors, which may make a diagnosis of either neurosis or alternatively mata Māori more appropriate. And Ms Egan says that's exactly what happened to her aunt. She has a connection with the spirit world, Matakiti. She was committed to carried in hospital. So as a result, Ms Egan's own parents discouraged her from recognising her gift. And that's carried on with her through her life. She said she was terrified she might be locked up in the nut house like my auntie. And because of that, she was nervous every time she saw a nurse or a doctor. Ms. Harris also gave similar evidence regarding her mother. And not only can cultural misunderstanding lead to them being disproportionately representative, but once they get into the system, they're treated in a culturally inappropriate way. Yep, okay, wrap up. All right, I'll leave the traditional healing to speak for itself. Move on to the relief. The claimants are seeking a finding that the Crown failed to provide adequate health care, recommendation that they take practical steps to introduce policy initiatives to ensure Maori gain more access, and to combat the disparities between Maori and non-Maori, and a recommendation that the Crown make funding available for research into contemporary uses of rongoa and the benefits of rongoa as a viable treatment option. Sir, if there are no questions, those are the submissions. Robert?
I just have one question. When I look at the mortality rates and your comparisons, it strikes me that these aren't diseases and conditions that are immediately identifiable as being conditions of poverty. They seem to almost stand out beside that. So do you have a comment on that and the implications of that?
Well, you've got things like heart disease and diabetes. I mean, ironically, you think of people being obese, overweight, and that affecting those. So how can that be a disease of poverty? But it's tied up with poor nutrition, poor education, things like suicide, the despair that exists because people are marginalised, because they're separated from their culture, because they're living in substandard housing, they're unemployed or underemployed, they're crowded in with with everybody else, and nobody's got any hope. So I think some of these things are very much associated with deprivation, but I'm not a public health expert.
I suppose the point that there's beyond questions of living conditions, there very much is a problem of access to the health system that's part and parcel of this problem.
Yes, yes, it's a foreign system. So there's a problem with trusting it that we've heard about. I mean, there's a physical problem that if you live out in the, if you live 20 or 30 miles from the hospital, and you don't have a car, and if you do, you can't afford the petrol in it anyway, does prevent some of that access. So we really need to find a way to perhaps take the hospital to the people rather than bring the people to the hospital.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. We have no further questions, Mr. Lawless. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. In that case, I'll move on to the 2063.
It's 3.3.255.
Yes, sir. Okay. 7 minutes. All right. Well, so this is a nice, short, discreet claim. It's by a small iwi called Ngāti Taimanuiti, or Ngāti Tai. Part of their problem is that somewhere they dropped off the radar and haven't had their recognition. But they were an iwi which at the time of the treaty had extensive land interests on both sides of the Waitemata Harbour. Obviously we can only take cognizance in this tribunal of one side, and that's fine. So relevant to this inquiry, the land they had ran from North Head, Devonport, past the Whangaparoa Peninsula and into Orewa, and then ran inland towards Waitoki, Kaukopakapa, and back around. The rangatira at that time was a gentleman by the name of Hetaraka Takapuna. Now his name lives on in the very affluent North Shore suburb, but unfortunately and sadly for Ngāti Tai, they don't have any land left in that area. They lost all their land, they were made landless by three things: the Maharangi purchase, two old land claims, and some poor performance in the Native Land Court. And not only that, sir, but to add insult to injury, when there was a little bit of compensation handed out in the 1940s and 50s, they weren't at the table because somebody decided that they were part of a different iwi. So they got confused with, and they were assumed to be part of another iwi with a confusingly similar name, Ngaitai, which originated on the east coast and migrated, or one branch migrated into the Hauraki, Auckland area. And all of that is dealt with in Ms. Cotter Williams' brief. And if I could take you, perhaps, sir, to paragraph 2 of the closing submissions, you'll see set out there a whakapapa for Ngāti Tai. That was given by Heteraka Takapuna at 2 very early Native Land Court hearings. When Ms. Cotter Williams presented that, her evidence, it was uncontroverted, and furthermore it was confirmed in cross-examination by Mr. McBurney that our Ngāti Tai Manawiti, is not Ngaitai. And sir, the Crown has helpfully and properly in my submission conceded certain things, that the Marangi purchase and the taking of surplus lands breached the treaty obligations. It's not entirely clear from the historical evidence whether it all went, which one was responsible, but they lost it either through old land claims or through the Marangi purchase. So there's really only 2 questions. One is, were Ngāti Tai, are they an iwi, and did they have land in the Marangi area that they lost through these mechanisms? Now, the first one I've covered, sir, was in Mrs. Cotter Williams' evidence. It was uncontested, and Mr. McBurney agreed with it. The second one, it's not in dispute that the claimant's tupuna, Heteraka Takapuna, was the vendor in those 2 old land claims, 453 and 454. It's 20,000 acres, so that pretty much establishes that Ngāti Tai's land interests were quite substantial. They lost the bulk of their land through the purchase. They lost another 20,000 acres at Pukeatua near Kaukopakapa. Similar sort of thing. Crown purported to buy it from Ngāti Whātua.